It's customary for Boise State to confer an honorary doctoral degree upon a deserving individual each spring during this ceremony. An honorary doctorate is awarded to recognize an individual of outstanding accomplishment in scholarship, creativity, public service, education, and human welfare. We are proud of this tradition and the significance it holds for all of us. This year's nominee is especially deserving, and we are thrilled to have him with us today. Timothy Eagan is one of today's leading voices and opinion makers, whether focused on our American history or the current state of our nation. A Northwest native based in Seattle, Mr. Eagan has spent 18 years as a writer for the New York Times, focusing on the environment, the American West, and politics. He is also the author of 8 books, including The Big Burn, Teddy Roosevelt, and The Fire That Saved America, a fascinating history of the devastating forest fires that swept across northern Idaho in 1910. His nonfiction account of the Dust Bowl, The Worst Hard Time, won the 2006 National Book Award, considered one of the nation's highest literary honors, and was featured prominently in the 2012 Ken Burns film on the Dust Bowl. In 2013, Tim Eagan received the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction and Nonfiction for Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher, his exploration of the famed Western photographer Edward Curtis. In his most recent book of nonfiction, The Immortal Irishman, Mr. Eagan tells the true story of Thomas Francis Marr and his unlikely journey from famine-plagued Ireland to a penal colony in Tasmania, then to America, and a leadership role in the Civil War, and finally to the governor's office in the Montana Territory. Those with Irish roots, almost 40 million Americans at last count, will appreciate the attention to detail and historical detective work as he outlines the legacy of his larger-than-life Irishman who left an indelible mark on his adopted country. Tim Eagan has devoted himself to understanding both past and present and what they both mean to our future. His opinion column in the New York Times, which runs weekly, has been referred to as required reading for anyone who hopes to understand the state of our politics. He was honored for his journalistic work with the Pulitzer Prize in 2001 as part of a team of reporters who wrote the series, How Race is Lived in America. Mr. Eagan is undoubtedly among today's most thoughtful analysts of the American experience. I am very pleased to bestow this degree and honorary doctorate of humane letters to an author and opinion leader who has made an indelible contribution to our knowledge and understanding of historical events, as well as the current state of our nation. Mr. Timothy Eagan. All right.
Thank you. I feel smarter already. Wow. Well, thank you, President Custra, and thank you, Bronco Nation, all you grads, and an early Happy Mother's Day to all you moms. Also, following Alessio, the most interesting man alive, tough act to follow, I'm telling you. But I do want to let you know, when you're a starving artist, that squirrel thing you did, there's probably a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts for that. So, and someone would stage that in New York somewhere. You can get money for it, so don't let that slip away. Let me thank you for this extraordinary thing, this honorary doctorate. But I have to let you all in on a little secret here in the intimacy of the Taco Bell arena. I don't think I told President Custra this. He may have changed his mind if I did. It took me 7 years to get out of college. That's undergrad. 7 years. There was a change of majors, a change of girlfriends, and this will really date me. College was almost free then. So I liked college. I didn't see any reason to ever leave college. So I took my 7 years to get my degree. So I hope you don't take back this honorary doctorate because of that. But in contrast to my honorary doctorate, all of you have earned real ones. You did it. You worked your butts off. You worked through your doubts, the hardest one being the what am I going to do with my life conundrum. And believe me, that is a lifetime thing. You may never figure that out. It's good to continue in that journey. So for all of that, you grads take a bow. But you parents take a bow as well. Because remember this adage, you're not losing a child, you're gaining a bank account. I just got my second kid out of school and I said, no 7-year plan for you, baby. Not at 40 grand a year. Last fall, I threw a big wedding for my daughter, my one and only daughter. I have 2 kids. It was a destination wedding for 200 people in the San Juan Islands. I was feeling very father of the bride, feeling very much like Steve Martin. In fact, we watched the movie like 3 times in advance of that. Here was my little girl, my little baby, marrying the man of her dreams. Thank God I like the guy. It was a beautiful day, and just at the start of the ceremony, before we walked down, and I were to give away my little girl for all time, one of my best friends whispered some advice into my ear. He said, Tim, take a minute and look around. Take this all in. Freeze time. Hold this memory. And I would urge all of you to do the same thing today. It's going to be a crazy day. It's going to end up as a crazy night. But at some point, freeze time, because this memory will go through the rest of your life. Now, commencement speakers, even ones who took 7 years to get out of college, are expected to offer advice. I don't necessarily feel very qualified to give advice, but with my newly minted honorary doctorate from Bronco Nation, I am willing to pass on some advice from others much smarter than me. So a few quick suggestions as we launch you into the world today. First, failure is an option. One of the great things about the Pacific Northwest, one of the reasons I love this place, is because we give each other room to fail. There's not as much pressure as there is in the East Coast, or certainly in Europe. I lived in Italy for a while, and they don't tolerate failure. We have room to fail here. We're not bound to the old ways. Failure can also be a great motivator. The Beatles failed in their first audition for a record album. The producer said, guitar music is on the way out. 27 publishers turned down Dr. Seuss's first book. 27. He's Dr. Seuss. And every publisher turned down Norman MacLean, who wrote my personal masterpiece, A River Runs Through It. Second, find time every day to do something what your heart desires and not just what you have to do. You know, there's an old adage that at age 20, we worry about what others think of us. At age 40, we don't care what they think of us. At age 60, we discover they haven't been thinking about us at all. So take the view of the 60-year-old and follow your curiosity. Allow for some serendipitous moments. And maybe in that pause, you'll see the value of public service. Number 3, grudges. Let them go. I was in a long-term festering feud with somebody from college. I hated the son of a gun. It was going on 20 years, and then one day I decided in my 40-something days I was going to let it go. So I saw my nemesis at a party. His name was Peter. I walked up to him and I said, you know, Peter, you and I should end this long, bitter feud we've had. And he looked at me. He was genuinely puzzled, and he said, are we in a feud? And I realized it was all on my side. He wouldn't even grant me my feud. Number four, anchor yourself. Anchor yourself. We are a transient nation, 321 million Americans. You can live anywhere, of course. I chose to stay in the Pacific Northwest, where my mother was born, where my grandmother died. The more I traveled, the more I realized that every place has something wrong with it. The philosopher Wendell Berry said, you can't know who you are if you don't know where you are. And where we are is a place where we are lucky to be. For our good days are better than those of almost any other place. Finally, and I think this is the most important thing, know your story. Each of you had to write an essay in order to get in here. But you don't have to write an essay in order to get out of here. If you did, I would ask you to consider your story. I would ask you to consider where you'll be in 10 years and think about really where you were when you were 12 or 11, 10 years ago. Think about how your family came to be where they are and why they are there. The single best thing I did when my mother was dying was have my daughter sit down with her and let my mother tell her her story. My mom had terminal cancer. She had a brain tumor. My daughter was then in college, a freshman, and the freshman and the 81-year-old sat and spoke together over a course of several days, and what unspooled was a remarkable life. My mother told her about going from post-war Germany, just after the Allies took over with her father, a lieutenant in the Allied Army, of being in love for the first time and not being loved back, but then finding true love. She told her what it was like to be a mother of 7 when all she really wanted to be was a career woman. She told her of feeling lonely at times and how music, playing the piano, could send her someplace else. She told my little girl how she found herself in reading. She found herself getting lost in books, which were passed on to me, her oldest son. Now, with the book I wrote about the Dust Bowl, which President Custra mentioned, I was very lucky. I would go from town to town on the high plains of these godforsaken places, counties that have fewer people now than they had 110 years ago, and they're just full of old people. The young people have all left them. And I would find these folks, and I would sit in a little semicircle with these mostly women, because women outlive the men, and I would have them tell me their story. They were in their 90s, and I was lucky because they were the last people to live through one of the most extraordinary episodes in our history, and I got to get the baton from them and passed it on. And they told me things that were unbelievable about growing up in a sod house, about seeing storms that were the size of the Rocky Mountains, 5,000 vertical feet high, 100 miles wide, rolling into your tiny little house and making midnight out of a bright sunny noonday. They told me about eating roadkill because they were so hungry. They told me about some of them having to give up their children because they were so poor. And they said that they'd stopped telling these stories for years and years and years because no one would believe them. No one would listen to them. Who could possibly believe there were people alive today who grew up in sod houses? So I think the same is true of many members of the greatest generation, those who survived the Great Depression and beat Adolf Hitler's Nazis. So if you have World War II vets in your family, I urge you all to sit down and get their story. Do what my daughter did with my mother and sit and let your World War II veteran mother or father tell that story, because it's going to become your story. As time passes on, you will see how your world fits with theirs, and their world will become part of yours. I spent a lot of time in American Indian country working on a book about Edward Curtis. You know, the tribes, they have what's called creation myths, which is where they came from. Every tribe has a different creation myth, but it's the story of how they came to be, how their people came to the earth. And the Sioux Indians have a saying, a people without history are like wind on the buffalo grass. And we don't want to be wind on the buffalo grass. I'll close in telling you about myself, an Irish American. I was sort of a lapsed Irish American. And then I went in search of my heritage. I wrote this book about the Irish American experience because I wanted to know where I came from. I had heard variations of the line from the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, to be Irish is to know that the world will always break your heart. And I found that that wasn't always true. So a few years ago, before my mother died, when I was researching this book, I took all of us, 8 Eagans, from my mother on down to my kids, back to Ireland. And in County Waterford, we found my mother's town, and in County Clare, we found my father's town, the Eagan family. We knew it because there were only 2 surviving businesses in that little town. One was Eagan's Pub, and across the street, I'm not kidding you, was the other surviving business, Eagan's Wine and Books. And my mother said, we've got it covered. So that night, drinking and dancing in that pub to the traditional music, which is played with a lamb's bladder, somewhat like a bagpipe out of a bladder, and talking with the distant members of my tribe and my clan, becoming increasingly hard to understand them as the night went on. My brother had this huge grin on his face, and he looked at me and he slapped my brother Danny, he slapped his arm around me, he said, Timmy, I finally feel at home, a nation of lyrical whiskey drinkers. So you come to realize in this journey of personal narrative, I'm not random. I'm not just a mass of cells placed in this school, in this home, in this city, in this country for no reason. I came from somewhere, I'm on my way somewhere and someplace. And you may not know where you're going, but at least you know where you're from. And an understanding of that past is the way, I think, to get through any uncertain future. So grads, go out and find your story before you take flight. May your days be prosperous and creative, and I know I will always remember this day here in Boise State. Thank you.
Wow, that's great. Thank you, Tim Eagan. Thank you so much.